Okay, well, welcome. I'm Dan DeGryse, and welcome to Straight Talk on fire engineering and our Humpday Hangout. I spent the last 30 years in the fire service, retired November 3rd, 2019, and I also concurrently had another career, spent 34 years in the behavioral health world. Presently in the director of the Rosecrans Fluorine program. And thanks to the old man in the group, Chief Bobby Halton, he has given us this platform to kind of talk about behavioral health, believe it or not. My co-host is none other than Rob Fisher, Battalion Chief Rob Fisher from Snohomish, Washington. Looking very cool in his uniform today.
I'm impressed you were able to say Snohomish.
I've been practicing that. I've been practicing Snohomish and making sure that I say retired Dan DeGryse. We have a special guest today, James Geering. And I just want to kind of introduce him, and then I'll let our co-host Rob and Bobby Halton say a few words. But our special guest today, James Geering, you might know him from his own podcast. He's been doing that for, and forgive me, many years. I don't know exactly if it's been 3 or 4, but I know he's on his 305th episode. I was way back in the hundreds, so I don't know if that's good or bad. I wasn't 1 or 2. I was 100 and something. Anyhow, and that was a couple of years ago. So it's actually kind of cool to have this venue to have James here. James started in the fire service back in July of 2004. He's a paramedic, firefighter, and also has a bachelor's in applied sciences. As I said, he's the host and CEO of Behind the Shield podcast. Family man, stunt double, but maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. I think that's kind of cool. I'm a stunt double for some certain people. You could get Bobby. And what was cool too is besides me being on James' podcast, he came to the 2019 Rosecrans Symposium that we held in San Antonio, Texas, and gave him a platform kind of to share a little bit about himself. And that kind of spurred our conversation about having him on here because he, as I said, interviewed 305 different people from all over the world. And I'm like, who has interviewed you? You got to have a story. So before I throw it to you with a question, James, Rob, you're at work. You want to say
hi, everybody. Robbie Fisher, Education Chair, Trainee Trustee, Pools International, peer support guy here in Snohomish County, and a good friend of Danny's. Fortunate to be a part of the show with Danny for the last year and some change. And when you introduced yourself, Dan, you said 30 years retired is what I heard. 30 years retired on the job. And then you said retired in November. So maybe I'm playing into that a little bit too much. Maybe you were retired for 30 years on the job and nobody knew about it. But and I want to know who you stunt double for. Who do you stunt double for? But
Billy Bob Thornton.
You know, I could see that. I could see I could see that look there. I got to tell you, Danny, this is a show that I was looking forward to because I've listened to James for a while. I can't catch all of his shows because he does too many damn podcasts, and it's hard to keep up on it. And I've only met James once at the Rosecrans Symposium, and but I'm with James a lot. I drive to and from work, and I'm usually listening to a podcast to and from work. And so I get to hear his voice all the time. And when we started this, I didn't see his face until just recently. So I was wondering if he was trying to hide off camera and stay behind the microphone like he's used to. But I was glad to see that he does have his camera on. So Yeah, I'm at work today, so hopefully I don't have to go on anything. Just couldn't get coverage for the hour while we were going to do this. So thank you for having me.
Cool. And the man that doesn't need any introduction other than the grand, supreme, exalted one, old man, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for that incredibly embarrassing introduction. So, just an old firefighter. Yeah, I also know James from his podcasts, and I've been a guest on his show. I think I was 309. If he's done 310, I was 309. And I don't think there's a pecking order, Dan, as to when he gets to you. It's when he gets to you, which I thought was kind of funny because I'm old, so I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. I'll just be honest. So I'd never listened to James, and the first thing he does is like a background, a history, and like I don't do that. So he really caught me off guard, and I was like, "Hey, dude, I'm here to talk about firefighting. Don't ask any questions about me. I don't do that." So as Dan knows, my idea of counseling is, yeah, I'm good. I'm fine. Good talk. So that's it. So I'm obviously not the guy to be the poster boy for mental health or podcast guests, obviously. Poor James was like, what's wrong with this guy? He doesn't want to talk about anything. So yeah, terrible. So one thing I would like to share, so for me, take a personal note for a minute here. Two things. Thank you, Dan, for doing this, and Rob, first of all. And James, thank you for being a guest. I can't tell you how much I appreciate people taking their time to do this. But in my other life, I'm a car guy. Always have been, always will be. And today, the American Fire Service lost one of our great icons, a guy who a lot of people don't know about. His name was Gale Halderman. And Gale Halderman was a friend of mine and a really important part of my life. He designed the Mustang. He drew the original concept for the 1964 and a half Mustang. He drew it in 1962 as part of his job for Ford Motor Company. He worked at the Big Blue Oval. He was on the Falcon project. And when Mr. Iacocca launched this contest between several of his design groups at Ford, Gale was the gentleman who drew what would later become the Mustang. Originally it was called the Cougar, but it became the Mustang at the last minute. Great story, and it had nothing to do with the airplane. Another piece of Mustang confusion that a lot of people have. But he was my friend, and so this morning he passed away, and just was one of the neatest guys in the world. And on my Mustang, he signed my glove box. So like people have Shelby's with Carroll Shelby's name on them, everybody knows that. And my Mustang has Gale Halderman. So he was the guy. And oftentimes, folks who do really, really cool things and are really responsible for something get kind of lost in history, right? Like Mr. Iacocca was bigger than life, and there were other men on Mr. Halderman's design team, but Mr. Gale was the guy who drew that. That was him. It was all him. You know what I mean? And a really interesting point that a lot of people don't know, but the Mustang violated 57 standards of automobiles when Mr. Halderman designed it. So it was like my kind of car. Like you could have broken more rules, but they would have never built it. So, but they got it built, and it became, to me, one of the most iconic automobiles of all time. Irrespective of whether you're a car person or not, most people recognize the Mustang, right? I mean, some might recognize the Charger or the GTO or the Le Mans or the Chevelle or the Chevette and the Corvette. I think the Corvette and the Mustang are probably the two that, irrespective of how much you know about cars, you should be able to identify those two cars. And I'm sure there are some morally deficient miscreants who should be cast out into the wilderness on their own who can't identify them. But that's just my opinion as a car guy. So thank you for letting me share with the world the passing of a really truly an American icon, somebody who gave us something that maybe people around the world, and James could probably speak to that. I know there's French Mustang people and Australian Mustang people, and so I think around the world people know that car that he drew, and he was the quintessential gentleman. He was elegant and kind and forgiving and soft spoken, and it was interesting. He went to art school with Jonathan Winters. Jonathan Winters sat next to him, the comedian, and he said, "Yeah, he went on to do other things." So, and Mr. Halderman kept drawing and designing. So thank you, and James, thank you for being here. And when you talk about straight talk, I think it helps when you're going through stuff like that you talk about it. And for my world, losing Gail Halderman's a big deal.
Well, Bob, thanks for being here and also sharing that information. It kind of leads me to the thing that I didn't introduce or say, is to recognize all the men and women in uniform, especially the fire service, obviously the men and women in blue and the light blue too, and all the people that are trying to manage life in general, as well as this COVID-19 crisis. And I know for my department that I used to work at, Rob, have lost two people to COVID-19, line of duty deaths, and one just recently to a stroke. And there's many people out there that are either in quarantine themselves or their family members that are also in the nursing field or healthcare or wherever they are in a job. Some people that are probably in a hospital and so forth. So hopefully we find you all well and you're in a good spot. And this is Straight Talk. So anything kind of goes in the discussion here. So James, to you, I know that's a heck of an introduction for this is what we do. And that's what Bobby does too. Where do we find you right now?
I'm sitting in Ocala, Florida, and I just want to say, to tack on to Bobby's story and then yours as Dan, to everyone out there, we've obviously heard some tragic suicides around the world as well, some losses in the law enforcement side. But we have here Lieutenant Eric Sienna, the Orange County Fire, who was battling cancer, just had brain surgery and just got home yesterday. So I want to make sure that we mention that, Eric, that we're all thinking of you and wish you a very speedy recovery. So yeah, but Ocala, Florida is where I'm sitting right now.
So I did like you until you said that. And I'm like, I'm torrential rainstorm and it's moving 4 miles per hour. So it's been above us for 3 days. Anyhow, we'll move on. Rob, you got a question for him?
Yeah. So James, what led you to the fire service?
I'll give you the cliff notes because it's a long drawn out story, but very long story short. I had always wanted to be a fireman when I was a little boy, fireman and a doctor and a pirate and a stuntman. So I chose two of them kind of, but I was told I was colorblind as a little boy in England when we did the annual physicals. And they said, you can't be a firefighter, you can't be a pilot, all the cool, schoolboy things that you dream about doing. So I discounted it for years and years and years. And then I had an epiphany. I'm not the sharpest tool in the box. So it took me about 26 years old to realize I wasn't colorblind because I could see colors. That should have been the big clue. So challenged the medical when I came over here, passed. And then I happened to move right next to Orange County's fire academy here in Orlando. So went to school there and that was it. So just literally that one little being told you couldn't until you actually challenged that idea really got in the way for a long time. But I think the universe intended me to become a firefighter paramedic in America for some reason.
What brought you to the States then?
My now ex-wife. We met when we mentioned stunts. I did stunts in Japan, and I met my wife there. Had a little boy. We got divorced, but I we moved to America before that, and I stayed here. So that was pretty much it.
Oh, I think something happened with my screen. All right. So you've been in the fire service for 16 years, or has it been 15?
Actively 14. I retired about a year and a half ago.
Right. So that's what led me to this question is that, and you could certainly share, because I know that you've been, paramedic, a firefighter. I don't know if you were on an ambulance. Obviously, you wanted to help people, assist people, and that's kind of what you're doing with the podcast. And but what led you to leaving the fire service?
Well, with my son's mother, it took me initially to Hialeah, Miami area for my first department. Then we went out to California. So geography took me out there. I worked for Anaheim for a few years and then came to the Orange County area for the last 10. And about 5 years ago, we had a couple of awful years in this area where I went to about, I think I always struggle with a number. I think it was either 6 or 7 firefighter funerals, people that we knew. And it wasn't one thing. It was everything from cancer, heart disease, autoimmune disease, suicide, overdose. And it really, coming from an exercise physiology background, it really made me question why we were losing so many people when we were starting to address things like clean cab. And, what the last department I ran at didn't really run a lot of fire at all. And they were still dropping like flies. So I started the podcast to try and bring the experts of the world in. So, I mean, Bobby and Dan, you were both on there. Rob, and we're going to be doing one soon. I know we talked about it at the conference. But it's true. Like, so what we have a habit of doing is attending a 2-day course and then masquerading as an expert when you come back, which, that's the first step. But there are so many people doing things around the world in different countries and different professions that I realized were applicable to what we do. So I was still working full time then. I was doing the podcast as well. And I hit a crossroads where my last department, let's just be PC and say it was very complacent. Fought very hard to try and bring some of the bars up. Was kind of hitting my head up against a brick wall. And at the same time, the podcast was growing and growing, and I was seeing how many people were listening. And it was kind of that force multiplier philosophy then. I could run one call at a time, a lot of which really weren't emergencies in that particular area, or I could focus my time on bringing as much value as I could to the podcast and travel a little bit more, do more face-to-face, do the conference, for example. And so I basically cashed out my retirement, gave myself a salary for a year and a half, which ran out right before COVID. And then and just took the plunge because, like you said, I became a fireman to help. And this seemed like that was this bizarre door that opened to help in a slightly different way. So I miss obviously running the calls, but I hope that sacrifice has resulted in a lot more people getting knowledge that they need.
All right, so you kind of answered 2 questions. Obviously we put these questions out so we don't throw any curveballs to you, but I'm going to throw you a curveball because you kind of answered the question I was going to ask. So you've been doing the podcast for a while, and you're at 300 and some, and I do appreciate it. I know I can speak for a lot of firefighters in the, at least I know for the American Fire Service, a lot of us are listening to you and enjoy your podcast. So you've had a number of people on your show. I think my first one that I listened to, and I can thank you for turning me on to being more of a sleep nerd. And I've tried to pass some of the stuff on to my good buddy Dan, but Doc Parsley was probably one of the first ones that I remember listening to. So who on your show? I know you've had Doc Parsley several times, but who's been like the most impactful and on your show that that like when you had this show that you knew that it was going to make massive change in the fire service?
Yeah, I think there's a few that I'll point to, and then I'll preface by saying every single episode has so much value. I mean, I'm so lucky to sit down, whether it's 30 minutes or 4.5 hours with my Anaheim crew that I did one time. It all depends on who it's listening to. But if I wanted to to guide people down a rabbit hole, then episode 6 with Kirk Parsley, absolutely. When you understand sleep deprivation, you start recognizing so many underlying factors for the physical problems that we see: cancer, heart disease, obesity, the mental health problems, and this kind of sleep when I'm dead mentality that we're so proud to embrace because we're first responders. We're gonna step up regardless. You realize that it's a myth. Like, you're going to be the best version of yourself with adequate rest and recovery as well. So episode 6, absolutely, in the subsequent ones with Kirk. There's Dustin Hawkins was probably the first story that really like ripped your heart open when it came to mental health, suicide, very, very near miss with suicide, and resilience, post-traumatic growth, and what he's doing now with Red Line Rescue. That's another one I always steer people towards. Travis Howes, actually very recently, has been a very well-received one too. He was one of the guys that had to do body recovery with his friends at the Charleston 9. But I mean, there's just so many. And then Julian Pineau is another big one. The way that man thinks is incredible. So I've done a few with him, a very recent one as well. But honestly, I tell people, whatever it is that you want to learn about, just send me a message and I'll shoot you, because there are a lot. So I'm more than happy to send you down the rabbit hole, and then you can kind of find your way either directly with that person's work or other episodes within the podcast.
So James, kind of like Rob. So for all the people that are viewing, we put together a bunch of questions that we give to the guests so that they're not surprised by the questions. But obviously in the conversation, and James, we've had a couple of conversations about what's on the table and what's off. You said that pretty much everything's on the table.
Yes.
And again, we don't want to throw curveballs at you. This is one of the questions that we did share with you, is that, and we always want to know what drives somebody. So why are you so passionate about getting the word out about health and wellness? And I get the fact that, you have a degree, so you have something that's there. You want to be in the fire service. But what's there? Where does that passion, where does that fire come from?
I mean, honestly, I've been very lucky. I guess the way that I was raised, kindness and compassion was kind of built in, and that completely pays over to the life of service that we all chose, which I think is honorable, even though we do it for free, and so many men and women out there are doing it for free, and hats off to them. But to me, I think it's knowing the perspective that we get as a firefighter, as a police officer, as a medic. You get to see in life what is true and what's complete BS. So, for example, the pills that people are sold for hypertension and diabetes and all these areas that don't work, because you've been the medic working that code on a 45-year-old that's got a bag of pills this big. So I think we kind of get to see behind the curtain, and what really drives me is when someone dies that was preventable. So whether it's a fellow firefighter, whether it's in a building collapse, whether it's a health issue, there are so many areas that we can stop trauma, whether it's physical trauma, mental trauma. And so I think that's really what it is. There's people, for example, sleep deprivation. Like, how many lives could have been saved, with some of the line of duty deaths that we had, if it was actually based to sleep deprivation, the falling off roofs, the getting lost in searches, the intersection wrecks. I mean, some of these we could easily bring back to that. So I think that was it. It's the same reason that we all signed up to do the job that we do. We want to stop, but the fire service can be very reactive. And I really found this was an opportunity to be proactive. And I think we get a lot of movements that go and march to the stairs of a Capitol building. And I think that's admirable. But that's asking those human beings in that building to change it for you. My goal is the opposite, to get us all pissed off enough to actually demand change collectively, almost like the Million Man March back in the day.
So my uncle really has a hard time with big pharma. And I think this is one of the problems that we see in the American Fire Service on the EMS side of things, is that we see people that there is a breakdown in our healthcare system where patients are getting medications. I mean, medications are good for certain things, but the doctors have missed communicating with each other, And so we have patients with just massive amounts of medication. And I know from some of your podcasts before, you're into more alternative, or, not that you're against medication, but you're into alternative stuff. Just curious, how does the, I guess not the homeopathic, but maybe the holistic style view of life, the holistic style of medicine, your views on that, or, what you're willing to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think really it's not anything other than an argument of prevention. So perfect example, and I'll try and frame this where it's not too crude, but ED, erectile dysfunction, that, from what I understand, wasn't even a term that was developed by the medical community. It was an ad agency that came up with that. So there's all these little, whatever color pills they are, people are taking them, from middle age onwards, and complete band-aid on the problem. The inability to get an erection is actually a terrifying precursor to heart disease, because it's all blood vessels that are getting blocked. So that is a perfect example. We're taking a pill to mask symptoms of an underlying cause that's going to kill you, as we know, because we've worked the code. So my thing is, for example, testosterone is another great example. There's a lot of people taking exogenous testosterone at the moment in the fire service, and in the community, especially the fire service, because our hormones are so wrecked by sleep deprivation. You reverse that, you get sleep back in. You don't need that anymore. You've just completely upended him. If you keep taking exogenous testosterone, your testes cease to produce it, and now you're basically an addict for that tea the rest of your life. You're going to be paying it forever. So that's my whole thing. The heart disease, these irreversible diseases that some of these people talk about are not irreversible. Good nutrition can reverse heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes. I believe a lot of cancers. I really do. Not all, but some. And so it's not that I'm anti-drug. I think that, Narcan is absolutely incredible. I think D50 is amazing to reverse, a diabetic coma. And I sure as hell don't want surgery without anesthesia. But these chronic disease management pills, that's the area where people are being lied to, because the reality is there's no money in healthy people or dead people, but you keep them somewhere in between, you're going to make a fortune.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to, I don't want to turn this into a sleep thing, but I think a lot of it has to do with our approach to sleep and how we need to deal with this as the American Fire Service, and what we're doing within our fire stations on creating, if we're going to have 24-hour shifts, what we have for a rest period while we're at the fire station. And then, sadly, a lot of firefighters choose to, because of our work schedule, want to work their asses off when they're away from work and be in construction and do a lot of extra stuff and never give themselves enough recovery, and that we're beating ourselves up, and not only physically but mentally, because we're not getting the rest, or we're not doing the things that we need to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, well, I think the big area that I've had so many people on, and I've asked as many experts in this kind of field as I can. So I've had the top sleep experts and performance experts from the Navy SEALs, the Army, the sports world, and they all concur the same way. To get their people to function at the highest level, you have to have that recovery. And when I ask them, I talk about the 56-hour work week, and I say, is this conducive? And they're like, no, you will save so much money if you invest in your people. So I think the 24-hour shift for the fire service is the most sensible. Splitting the shifts and alternating has proven to be horrible for law enforcement. It's a great example. But if you create, it ends up being like a portion of a shift, because you're going to give away Keller days, or you're going to give away some vacation days when you negotiate. But a 42-hour work week, which is completely acceptable in the Northeast, in Boca Raton, in Bryan, Ohio, where Paul Coombs works, they all work 42 hours. But then you ask someone in Orange County, California, and it's like, unicorn fighting rainbows. No, they're doing it in the same country that we live in. But I think the 24/72 would allow us to still work 24-hour shifts. It would give the rest and recovery for these men and women. There's definitely an ownership on the other side. If you are a firefighter or a police officer, don't take night shifts at the ER to make your extra money. You hang drywall in the day, you might be tired, but you're going to still sleep at home. That's fine. but there has to be an understanding. It's a two-way street. We have to be responsible as the responder, but our administration has to understand it's a false economy trying not to staff your departments properly. And then, God forbid you start throwing in mandatories, then, now they're working 72-plus-hour weeks. So you just look at your favorite sports team and then look at how they treat their athletes. We are no different. If you don't, Tim Kennedy gave a great example the other day. You get your favorite racehorse, you keep whipping and whipping it, eventually he's going to run into the ground. It's what we're doing with a lot of our people, especially outside the Northeast. So, and I've worked East Coast, West Coast. I've had a Kelly day half my career, no Kelly day the other half. And it's the thing. So do you want to look good in one fiscal year and get your Christmas bonus as administrator? Or do you want to be the person who actually took a bold step to save your county, city, whatever, millions over a span of decades by investing in the health of your people at the front end?
And I think your point about firefighters being like professional athletes is key, and that we need to act more like professional athletes and be treated as such. And that includes us, our own responsibility. So I know something's serious because Bobby got up, shut his door, and grabbed a book off the shelf. So I don't know if he's got something he wants to say before.
Yes,
that's a great
Matthew
book.
Walker.
It's a great book. I'm reading it right now for the second time.
I'm still trying to get him on the show. He's like a ghost on the internet, so still working on it.
I thought he was offended when James was talking about ED and he was getting up to leave, and I'm like, oh boy. I know Bobby not to get offended too often, but maybe we hit a nerve. So going back to sleep, and there's so many more things that are a part of that, James. And I think going back to our discussion when you had me on your podcast, I think one of the things that drove you to have a discussion with me, and part of it was your professional relationship with Dina Ali out of Raleigh, North Carolina. Dina, thanks for the connection there.
Yeah, thank you.
I know you had her on your show as well, and I know she's out there listening. Hopefully the shout out makes up for not mentioning her in the beginning. But I think that I've addressed stress in fire service for many years. Actually started back in 2008 and 2009 looking at suicide and trying to understand exactly where that begins. That got us in a discussion about health and wellness. And besides looking at the death toll in Chicago specifically through all our death certificates over a 20-year period, and looking at the incident rate of suicide, I also looked at longevity and how long people actually lived. And I think I shared with you that back in the 1990s, and there's a number of variables in there, right? Exercise and sleep and intake and just genetics and, a whole host of different things, wearing the mask or not wearing the masks, and how fires burn and what we inhale and skin absorption, all that type of stuff. But what I did share with you is that the average life expectancy after retirement for a Chicago firefighter back in the 90s was 4 years. Mm-hmm. That's not good. And then we looked at the next 10 years and it went up, but it only went up 7 years to a total of 11 years. I mean, that's in the year 2000 to 2010. I have not looked at the last 10 years, but when we look at what we're doing and helping people, and you touched on it, and so did Rob and Bobby, I know, and everybody here, is in regards to self-care, how we are going to have a long career, make it through 30 or 35 years, not only physically healthy, but mentally healthy, socially healthy, and then really have a healthy relationship with other people. Maybe our family, maybe our spouse, maybe our kids, maybe our parents. So when you were talking about the fact that you've done 305 podcasts and you've been in the fire service for 16 years or 15 years, and one of the things that we talk about in behavioral health, we talk about primary trauma. What many people don't talk about is secondary trauma, or what we identify here in the Florian program is vicarious trauma. Many people know about compassion fatigue and how we go on our first ambulance call, and then you go on your 1500th ambulance call, and you're just like, oh, another one of these psych emergencies, or another one of these guys that needs a Band-Aid, and there's a compassion fatigue that ultimately, if not taken care of, turns into burnout. But vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is something where you can have the same symptomology as if it happened to you, but you really experience it through the words and expressions from somebody else. That originated back, I believe, in 1995 from a clinician who was seeing people, her coworkers, that have been in the field for many years, that were counseling other people and were experiencing something, and they didn't have a name for it. They couldn't call it post-traumatic stress disorder because it wasn't directly happening to them. It was happening to them, but because of the stories from other people. So they identified it as vicarious trauma. 305 episodes. I've been in the field for 34 years, and I've done thousands of interventions and talking to different people, and not to put it on things. So from your standpoint, what have you experienced from hearing all these stories, and how do you take care of yourself, and how can you share that with the listeners?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I asked, a lot of the clinicians like yourself that same question, like, how do you offload, what you've absorbed? And I always think a good analogy is the Green Mile, Michael Clark Duncan's character. He's taking all that pain from these people. If you don't get rid of that pain, eventually it's gonna take you. So what I learned, as far as a lot of common denominators with the people interviewing that have these powerful stories that we don't think about, is the trauma we bring to the front door of this profession as well. So I had no idea how many men and women that we stand alongside that had been abused as a child, physically, sexually, verbally, however it was. So that was a big shock to me. But it was, I think there was a parallel journey for me where I had all these stories, and as you probably know, you sit down and talk to some of these men and women, you hear their stories, and you're just emotionally exhausted when you're done. And sometimes in tears listening to it, or but at the same time, the end of many of these stories, this is the post-traumatic growth. So here's what they've done with it. So I think for me, there was a parallel learning curve of how to deal with it, whether it was exercise, sleep, meditation, just talking. And I think that's the other thing about this and what we're doing today, is we're having a firehouse table conversation. So that's so healing. So even though you're hearing a tragic story, you're also getting that healing coming back to you as well. That being said, when I started the podcast, I've always worked in very busy departments. It was in the hood, as it were, for most of my career until the last station. But I would notice that if I was, just wrecked from a shift and then come home and then do an interview, you are so much more susceptible if you haven't been able to decompress, offload. So to answer your question, like I said, there's definitely that secondary from it. But I think seeing these people that have been through horrendous trauma, Dustin, Travis, and what they've used to cope. Dustin loves gardening. Travis is a stand-up comedian. I mean, there's all these different routes, but that's very empowering and uplifting. So if you're able to take away, the lessons from these men and women and then apply it, you have to actually do. You can't just say. You realize how you can be a lot more resilient, and you can cope with a lot of this trauma, as long as you know where that line is, where you need to take a mental health day, or whatever it is. So yeah, a very, very kind of strange parallel journey to answer your question.
So Rob's gonna go to a question that came from the internet, but before we go there, what do you do
to decompress?
Yes, sir.
It's funny. It's such a it's a common denominator with most of the people that I ask. It's one of my closing questions. So nature, incredibly healing, which is an interesting thing at the moment because COVID, a lot of isolation has shut all the places I think that are healing, the parks, the beaches. But that's one of mine. Exercise is huge. I have a 150-pound heavy bag that, especially through my divorce, took quite a beating. Let me see what else. Family time. I have a dog. So that's another interesting observation. If you look back at old world fire service, we had a therapy dog in the station, a Dalmatian. So the lawsuit world kind of made that go away. But yeah, so just it's really back to nature, back to basics, and then putting the damn cell phone down. That thing is cancerous. So yeah, lock it away in your bedroom and go take a walk and get out and get some sunlight on your face for an hour. And if you're on a balcony in New York right now, just do steps, but get outside.
That's what I'm doing right now. I mean, well, not right this second
I was
because I'm
going
on
to say,
duty.
I don't see your legs moving.
My legs aren't moving, but no, at home, I'm been cooped up in the condo in Seattle. And so spend a lot of time getting out and just walking the neighborhoods and avoiding other people and kind of trying to clear my mind and keep a little bit of the heart rate up and have some time with the wife to talk about what's going on in our life and some of the things that she's just lost her mom a couple weeks ago. So we've been working through all of that. But so the question from the internet is Cliff, this is amazing that we can do this and have a show and then people can pop in questions and we can get these out. But Cliff's question is the benefits of working with a smaller fire department versus a bigger fire department. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that's interesting. So I've got Sebastian Junger book Tribe sitting right next to me, and that is a huge piece of the puzzle, I think, for the fire service too. So when you have that cohesive crew, whether in a big service or a small department, Anaheim was super cohesive for me. That was one that I felt probably the most the most cohesive, for lack of a better word. That is so healing, so healing. And I think that's what people are struggling with now, with that being disrupted with COVID. I think that it's an issue when you get hurt and you're away from your crew, when you retire and you're away from your crew, when you promote. You see a lot of suicides, and if you noticed in the higher level officer positions. So I've worked for small departments. My last one was only 4 stations, and then I've worked for Orange County, which was 41. I think it's more now. And I think if you can create that cohesion in your crew, that is the most important thing. The small department, I was least happy, I'll be completely honest. And Anaheim, Hialeah, Orange County, all different sizes, kind of mid to large, but it was about that crew. It really was. So a crew can absolutely make or break. So if you're, a leader and you subscribe to we need to rotate crews, they're getting too comfortable, break them apart philosophy, just understand you're doing a huge amount of damage. But if you are in a small department or a big department and you're able to get like-minded men and women, work out together, sit down, eat together, put the cell phones away, train together, that's, to me, is the absolute recipe for success.
Yeah, I think that book, Sebastian Junger's book, that's one that everybody in the fire service, it should be on the bibliography for testing for company officer. It's probably one of my favorite books, and describing how we work and kind of the small unit dynamics and so I think that's a phenomenal book. So those that are listening, if you haven't read that book, pick it up. It's definitely worth a read.
Yeah, just to interject, Rob, the actual initial thing that got me thinking was humans tribally are supposed to be up to about 150 people is a tribe. More than that, you start getting into what many of us see in the urban setting, which is too many people, not enough connection. So if you have those larger departments, try and work out, whether it's battalions or districts, whatever you do, and create that cohesion there, because there are obviously larger departments where it's just too big to feel connected to everyone. So if you can create those subcultures that all interrelate, I think that's very important.
And it might be that it's somewhat individual and how you have to look at it, because when I started in the late 80s, my department was a couple of stations, and And we've since, up to this point now, we're 11 stations, not a big department in any way. But some of the guys that I came on the job with, they are frustrated over the fact that we're now a big department, 11 stations. And I still think, that we can be as an individual or as a company, we can, and as a tribe, we can be successful even as we're getting bigger. But you look at somebody like Dan working for the Chicago Fire Department. I mean, I don't know how many stations they have, but you can still be successful in those larger organizations if you're aware of a lot of these things. And I think that's what Unger's book talks about, is being aware of how you need to be a part of it and how you can contribute to be successful in your profession.
Yeah, to answer your question, 97 firehouses, 24 battalions. But here's the thing is, when I got in the fire service, I didn't know any different. I applied to probably 4 different ones. I was actually in the academy in Chicago and got offered 2 other ones, and they were smaller departments. I honestly didn't know any different, other than the fact that I live in Chicago. I think a good majority of the people go where they know, and then I'm learning more now are traveling and going to ones that they want to. But to the question from the internet or YouTube, that bigger department and a smaller department, what are the benefits? Man, it's a long discussion. For me, I enjoyed options, and you could work on the north side, the south side, downtown, the west side, southeast side of Chicago, and there was variety. There was no shortness of incidences, and also no shortness of personalities. And when the guys from the north side went to the south side, and we're not talking, a couple miles, we're talking, 15 miles. Even though we wore the same patch, we didn't always come from the same cloth. So there's pros and cons with that. From a smaller department, I've learned that when you're a smaller department, when you respond to incidences, most of the people. And that is a totally different experience than I've experienced myself. I've told people when I've spoke that I've responded to 3 out of the numerous calls that I've had in 30 years where I knew somebody, and that changed me. That changed me then, and it's imprinted in me to this day. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. I didn't always think of that until it happened to me. I always believed people don't care until it happens to them. I didn't believe too much in the stress of elder care until both my parents were in the hospital. And that's my shortcoming. And that's why I think having a guy like James on here to be able to have a venue where we can get various different people and their perspectives is great. Those are just a couple of things in regards to small and big departments. A smaller one too is you have 25 people to vote on something as opposed to 5,000 or 8,000. I've made it work for myself, and I've enjoyed it. Just like family, right? Family's family. You love them and you hate them. The same thing with maybe the department, and the things that you understand. So with that said, and we got about another 10 minutes left. What I'm curious about with James is that you obviously have a mission. You kind of shared about that. It's about health and wellness and getting good, solid, positive information out there for the people, for yourself, and for the people that you've worked with for many years. And I applaud you for that. Two questions. What don't we know about you And it's interesting because I just did a group here. I run the flooring program, 16 bed units specifically for uniformed service personnel. And I'll dig deep and I'll be like, hey, what's your number one resentment? And what's your number one loss? And I tell people, write it down. Some will share, not everybody will share because it's too personal. So I'm really kind of asking you, what is that thing that people don't know about you? And it could be good or bad, or difficult. Let's put it this way: good and or difficult. The other thing is with the mission of the podcast, where do you see it in the next few years?
Okay, well, I'll give you one answer because I think you'll find this interesting. So this was buried so deeply inside my mind that I literally only remembered it about 6 months ago. But I was almost killed in a house fire when I was about 4 years old. And while we're being vulnerable, I don't know if this is related or not, but I was a bedwetter till 12 or 13 years old. Used to have night terrors. They had to put bars on my windows because they found me halfway out the third-story window one night screaming. And I hadn't thought about it. I literally hadn't thought about it in my entire fire service career. And then when I started exploring and talking to all these mental health, amazing men and women like yourself, it wasn't like I had an aha moment, but I've been writing a book. And so I've been trying to pull anecdotes from my life, and all of a sudden this just kind of popped up. So it's really interesting now looking back with the whole childhood trauma thing. Like I said, bringing that into the profession. Like, is that what was driving me? The same way as so many of these men and women that were abused when they were little want to be the protector now. They want to be the soldier, the police officer, to stop other people being hurt. So I guess that's probably the best thing, is looking back now, wondering how that all factored in. I'm glad I stopped wetting my bed. It'd be embarrassed if I was married and still doing it. And then with the podcast, honestly, it's growth. It's the one metric I do pay attention to. The social media is a tool. Instagram seems to be doing quite well. Facebook, there's thousands and thousands of people that are friends or followers or whatever on each page, and I'll watch a video get watched like 13 times in a week. I mean, that's just such a mess. But the one metric is the downloads, because that's a man or woman somewhere on planet Earth, and it's literally all around the globe, that has hit play and listened to someone tell their story. And like Bobby was saying at the beginning, with the gentleman from designing the Mustang, storytelling is so powerful. So, and I think a lot of us can relate, when you have the kind of dry PowerPoint presentation, whether it's on the fire related stuff, mental health, whatever it is, it doesn't really resonate. But if someone gets up there and talks about when they fell through the roof during a truck operation, or a near suicide, it grabs people. So right now, in about 5 weeks, the show is going to hit 1 million downloads, which is funny because I still hasn't featured on any of those firefighter podcasts you should listen to lists yet to this day. But so I guess it's like a ninja podcast. So my goal is just to increase that. It's not about likes. It's not about anything other than every single time that number goes up, someone else has an opportunity to learn, which I hope is an opportunity to make a lifestyle change or an aha moment, which then will not only save their life if they're a responder, but think about how many thousands of people they're going to affect in their career. So that's the thing for me, is I hope it's as big as Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, some of these great podcasts that I've listened to for years, because I think the guests, it's not about me, it's about the guests. I think they need to be heard to the same magnitude. So that's, I don't know if it happened in a year, but that's the goal, is just to share it. It's a free library. The more people that come on, the bigger the library gets. So that would be the answer as far as a year or 5 years from now.
Well, James, we're getting some more questions, and I know we're kind of getting close to the end of the show. And I just, I just asked Dan. I said, we want to try to get to these questions before we close out really quick. And so one of the questions is, you mentioned divorce, and what advice do you have for a chief officer, company officer who may become aware of one of their firefighters going through divorce, custody battle, maybe taken from your personal experience, or if anybody that you've interviewed and might have been dealing with it, that you could offer up some advice?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of two parallel paths. My personal one, I went through my divorce. I was a single dad. I was also going through paramedic school and working on one of the busiest rescues in Orange County. So understand that divorce on its own, where someone's the rest of their life is great, is going to be an absolute nightmare for that person, you know. But take a sleep deprived, overworked responder. It's that compound effect. Where were they before this divorce happened? So that's something that you really need to take a step back and watch them closely. Talk to your crew and get them to change their perspective. I remember so many times someone would come in and they'd be in a bad mood and we'd start pushing their buttons. Now, sadly, I look back and go, well, what was going on with that person? They probably weren't just having a bad day. There was probably something underlying. So educating your crew to handle with kid gloves, and there's no other way to put it, to be a lot more gentle and a lot more open. And I think the fire service table is a great opportunity for other people to be vulnerable, open with a story about maybe one of the other crew has gone through a divorce, come out the other end, and try and get discussion, because those men and women, they need to offload. It is so exhausting. I mean, mine was it wasn't very amicable, and even to this day, when you share a child, it can still rise its ugly head over and over again. So yeah, really understanding that these people are probably fried, but then what we perceive as someone being overly emotional or unusually angry, whatever it is, that might be a very, very big red flag. So really make an effort as a crew to be there for that person. Again, crew workouts, crew training, outlets where they can kind of blow off some steam. Because one thing I've seen is, I know some of the first responder suicides, I've heard comments like, oh, well, they were going through a divorce. No, they weren't going through a divorce. They were a career firefighter that did all these things over and above their profession, and they were going through a divorce. So, you have to remember that many of us, that bucket might be almost full before the child gets sick, the divorce happens, you find your wife cheating, whatever it is. And that might be exhausting for that person, or it might put them completely over the edge. So I think you have to take that very, very seriously. I mean, like I said, one of the ones was an overdose. There was some signs of that gentleman, but the crew didn't act, and they felt awful after, and he ended up ODing, I think, by accident. But it's not just suicide. Think about addiction, alcoholism, all these areas, these unhealthy coping mechanisms, but really, really have your head in the swivel and try and create an environment for that person to be able to talk.
Yeah, I think about this in the American Fire Service, and I really wish that I was a firefighter back in the 50s and the 40s, so I could have experienced a different profession at the time. Because I think the one thing that we've lost is we become so isolated as firefighters, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but as we became more diverse, we really had a hard time adjusting to all of that. And so the kitchen table talk just is not the same. And I think the one thing that I, as a peer support individual, one of the things that I'm pushing in our department is getting back to the kitchen table, getting back to understanding the people that you work with, and having, I mean, you don't have to have a really close personal relationship with the individual, but God dang it, you should know what's going on in their life, or at least understand a little bit about them. Because as the fire service, we really like to find a wound and just kind of pick at it. And I think, generally speaking, if a firefighter knew that another one was having a divorce, or their spouse was cheating on them, and they were a little being different, they're just not meeting the norm of that individual, I don't think we would want to pick on them. But until you really understand how to be with people and understand people and have an understanding of them, we're not gonna be able to catch that. So that head on the swivel kind of gets stuck, and we just do what we traditionally do in the fire service, and that is have fun. Just keep on having fun with it. And sadly, we could pay a dear price later on. So I just think we need to learn to be to be better at the kitchen table. And even in COVID, 6 feet apart, but have those conversations, share a little bit about yourself, be vulnerable. I mean, you work a profession with other people that we're going to do things that you just don't get to do anywhere else. So being a little bit vulnerable and sharing that will help others understand kind of what's going on.
Yeah. And I think so many people have stories. So, be vulnerable sounds, oh, well, how am I supposed to do that? Just tell your story. All of us have these backgrounds. And what you're going to realize when the conversation starts, you're going to realize, okay, I'm not alone thinking A, B, and C. Like half my crew has gone through the same thing. So yeah, smash that Hollywood facade that you're supposed to be Arnold Schwarzenegger or Rambo. None of them ever served, so you shouldn't look up to them anyway. But yeah, reprogram what being a compassionate man or woman really is.
So to kind of finish off on this discussion here, we have one other question that we could get to in this time. I know we're kind of right around the hour mark, but this is not just for James, it's for Bobby and for Rob, and I'm going to kind of lead it off. It's a question from a gentleman, William Carey, and it kind of piggybacks on the discussion of divorce and issues in the fire service. And there's a lot of variables that are going on personally and professionally. The fire service has been around for a long time. It's going to be around for a long time afterwards. Problems have been around from the beginning of Adam and Eve, and going to be around forever as well. One thing for sure, change, right? The question is how do we address it? We deal with a career that is ever changing and deals with crisis, and that's what kind of we love. We don't know what the day is going to bring. It's going to bring some sort of chaos, and we're going to fix it. What we really haven't done really well is address the chaos within ourselves. We have, in the history, have not had an open forum throughout the whole fire service to where we share our problems other than that kitchen table. Sometimes that kitchen table ended up in verbal fights, and other times physical fights. And sometimes that kitchen table was at home, and sometimes that kitchen table was at a bar. When many people, as we know, were drinking their breakfast. That helped sometimes for socialization, but other times it really wasn't the best coping skill. There's been a discussion about PTSD and trauma and job-related stuff and suicide. I started talking about suicide back in 2008, 2009. Suicide's been around forever. The numbers continue to go up for society in general. It's a national crisis. Every state is supposed to have an organization to address it. It's not just to the fire service. Stigma. And if Bobby did something for me, which he probably still has resentments towards, where I asked him to talk about stigma. Stigma just didn't happen in the fire service. We didn't create it. We're not going to fix it. It's been around forever. But what we need to do, just like when we get a call over our terminal for an issue, what do we need to do? We need to address it. The number one behavioral health issue that I'm aware of is not PTSD. It is not depression. It's not suicide. The number one issue that I got calls for the 14 years I ran our union ZAP program was because of relationships. We do not get training other than from our parents and from what we kind of flub through in regards to how to have a relationship. And many of us have, unfortunately, gone through divorce. And some of us, luckily enough, have not gone through it, but come very close because of our poor skills, me included. So with that said, kind of like what you said, is that we have to have an open dialogue. That just doesn't have to come from the damn fire chief. It doesn't have to come from the lieutenant. It doesn't have to come from the captain or battalion chief. Yeah, they can set the stage and start modeling that, but it could start from the very first day you're in the academy and create that atmosphere that we did have at the kitchen table at times. But let's be honest, is that it was the officer or the senior man that held court there, and you listened. Many of us agreed, but some of us had difference of opinion, but you didn't dare say that. I've, in my career, have tried to create a venue where it's okay to share those thoughts. So without going any deeper, please, each one of you, share your thoughts on what I kind of talked about and moving forward. Seniority first.
Chief.
Well, I was practicing not participating, because otherwise, when you do, no, seriously, because of my seniority, you can suppress other people's conversation. So, which was fun to listen. And also, one of the reasons why I enjoy James's podcast is I get to hear people's worldviews, and it's a fascinating, it's fascinating to listen to. Seneca gave us great advice. And I think if you go back to ancient wisdom, there's so much to be learned from those folks, because knowledge like that's lasted centuries, literally centuries, has value, compared to some of the, stuff that was popular for a week or a day. And I guess now on Twitter, 11 and a half seconds, but which isn't wisdom or knowledge at all. But to Dan's point, I think that worldview has a lot to do with what James was talking about, right? And a lot of what Rob was talking about, and a lot about stigma. And no, we didn't invent stigma. Stigma's been around since the dawn of time. It became industrialized and it became weaponized during the eugenics movement and during the progressive movement. They used it as a tool towards the perfection of man kind of idea. Rousseau and if you look at Derrida and Lyotard and those kinds of mostly French philosophers, which kind of, there's a contradiction in terms, French and philosopher. But anyway, it's a joke. But anyway, I think to worldview is what a lot of you were talking about. In other words, if you're inclined towards liking larger organizations and that type of a setting, that's where you belong. If you like smaller, tighter groups, then a small department's where you belong. There's an old joke about a farmer sitting by the side of the road and the car pulls up and the guy says, "What's this town like?" And the farmer says, "What was your last town like?" And the guy says, "Wow, it was horrible. The people there were mean and cruel and couldn't wait to get out of there. We're looking for another place to live." And the farmer says, "Oh, you'll hate it here too. The people are mean and cruel." Guy drives off. Car pulls up 2 minutes later, says, "Hey," to the farmer, "what's this town like?" He says, "Well, what's your last town like?" He said, "Oh, it was wonderful. People were great. They were kind. We're going to really miss them." He said, "This town's perfect for you too. The people are great and kind, and you're going to love living here." So a lot of times it isn't about the size of the organization. It isn't about the schedule. It's about you. And I worked to James's point earlier, I worked the 4896, loved it. It was perfect for me. But some people it's the 24 on and 72. Some people it's the, whatever they've got. And so I think it's, and I've, I love to read. I read it all. And another great quote from Seneca, he said that generations from now, our descendants will be so amazed at the things that are so apparent to them that we didn't know. And I think that is constantly happening. So I love to hear what James is talking about, and I love the conversation. And it was nice to hear the interviewer's worldview versus the interviewer trying to get to someone else's worldview, which was really, really, really cool to hear. And some really cool questions as well. And as usual, Dan was vapid. So there was just nothing there. Again, it was just a dry hole, as they say in the oil business. Just kidding. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. And as we go through the psychological world, if you look at all the different schools that have gone, right? The behavioralists and and it all trends, right? And Dan probably knows that very well from his education. We tend to get enamored by what's trending in our generation or whatever. And my old man used to say, "Never throw out your skinny ties," So when he grew up, it was all about natural medicine and, whatever, because that's what they had. And then our generation went to, manufactured medicine, and that's what we had. And now we're going back to, natural medicine. And so, but I think that's a good thing. And I think that it's really hard nowadays because people ascribe motive to people's worldviews. And your worldview is, as James said so well, it's everything that's ever happened to you. It helps formulate your worldview, and it's yours. You own it. And it's not right or wrong or good or bad. It's who you are, and it's what you believe. And that's great. So I love this conversation, and I don't know what any of the answers are, and I don't think there are any easy answers when we talk about mental health and wellness, because some of the people I love the most in the world are struggling with that. And I've lost friends and family, and probably the condition of mankind, we always will. But I think it's neat that people offer stuff up like, well, maybe this is what you need. Maybe that's what you need. So some people need to vent. I don't. I just go out and find some stranger and beat the heck out of them. And then I'm just kidding. It's a joke. It's a joke. But you know what I mean? It's everybody's going to cope in a different way. Everybody's going to grieve in a different way. And that's okay. I think, and it's really hard today, especially with social media, where you have people like Zuckerberg who decide what's right and wrong or true and not true. And he's a complete butthead, to use a good word for him, not what I'd like to say. And no, we need to have forums where, to James's point, and what James does is allow people to say what they really think. And nowadays, with one of the largest platforms in the world is denying people the opportunity to say they want to organize to go protest the government, which is the number one fundamental constitutional right. And when that starts happening, that's a dark day for America. And when we tolerate it, it's an even darker day. So thank you, James, for bringing people's world's view into our worlds. And thank you for the way you do it, because, you never shut them down. And so I hope that helps. But I'll shut up now.
Well, thank you. I guess I'll carry on from that. So what's fascinating for me, and the reason why I love listening, and I hope I shut up as much as I should when I'm interviewing, but is that everyone has a story first. So the more stories that are out there, the more people kind of realize Me Too. I know that hashtag Me Too has been brutalized, but that's how we should be thinking as men and women in the fire service. Like, you're not weak, you're not alone, you're not, just falling at every hurdle and everyone else is just nailing it because it's a facade. We all have a facade out there. But I think for what I've realized, how we reach our men and women is mental health and some of these other areas, like the working, for example, like, there's a badge of honor of taking all the extra shifts. And, I worked 96, I worked, 100 and whatever, is when we flip that around. And we hear a lot in our profession about it's for them. Well, it is for them. So that involves self-care. So if you're just flogging that racehorse, that's not for them anymore. You're beating yourself down. And it's the physical health and it's the mental health. So creating an environment around a firehouse table to talk is for them, because it's, for them should be your crew, and then that radiates out to the people we serve. And the same with, physical health standards. If you're an administration or union leadership and you're opposing things that are going to increase your men and women's wellness and longevity, then shame on you. Simple as that. We should be looking at ourselves as athletes. And so physically we should be able to perform, and mentally we should be able to perform. So I think if we reframe mental health, which is the exact right word, where we get through whatever trauma we're going through and become more resilient and have post-traumatic growth, and we overcome back injuries and we go back to work and we're stronger and we're moving better, then I think that's how we get our professions to buy back in. It's not weakness, it's the opposite. You want to be the best firefighter, best police officer, best medic you can be. You need to work on mindfulness. You need to work on what you're eating, the movement that you're doing, the number of times you're training as a crew, and those all factor in. So if we can throw away that stigma that has just manifested, and I really think it's through popular culture since I was little. I grew up in the 80s and realized that we need all those facets to be the best version of ourselves, so then we can be the best protectors and sheepdogs in the community. I think that's really how we we reframe this whole topic.
Well, I will. I guess I will close out a little bit with this, and I will just step back. You never follow up Bobby. I've been to FDIC too many times and watched people have to follow up after Bobby. So I'm glad you stepped in there. And we're here talking to you, so everybody wants to hear you, not hear us. But I would say the thing that I love about your show is you are giving the listener so many different views, so many different perspectives, and I think that is extremely important. And as a person that likes to travel, my wife and I, we love traveling the world. And I don't agree with everything that is out in the world, but what I do really like is I like seeing the various things that are in the world. And I think you can apply that across anything, be it in the fire service, whatever your profession is that if you seek to understand first and then you speak, then I think that you will gain a lot from that. And so I think that a lot of my well-being and a lot of my development and things that I enjoy in my life is because I try to get a variety and exposure to so many different things, and I try to understand it. And I won't agree with everything that's out there, but I think just learning about it, it's kind of like the process of learning, period. So those are my last words to whatever Danny's question was about 15 minutes ago. But I will, I don't have any last words. I don't know if Danny has anything he wants to say or if Bobby does, but where can we reach you, James? Or where can anybody reach you?
Okay, so the Behind the Shield podcast is on all the podcast apps. So if you're either side of the iTunes Android fence, there's iTunes or the apps that are on Android, you can find it there. The website Behind the Shield was taken, so I just did my name, so it's jamesgeering.com. You can reach out to me through there. Instagram's probably the best platform. We're on Facebook, but like I said, I think 2.5 people and a badger actually get to see what I post. So but yeah, Behind the Shield 911 on Instagram. But yeah, I mean, just through the website and reach out. I mean, I'm just a normal fireman like the rest of us. There's nothing special, but I love hearing feedback on the episodes. People asking, can you send an episode, and then guest suggestions. I mean, Rosecrans had Sally on recently. I had Sarah Jenke. So those are always a great source too. So if you have people that you think you'd like to hear on there, and Rob hopefully will do one soon, then yeah, that's the other thing. But that's where you can find it, Behind the Shield podcast. Just don't look at the top firefighter lists.
Well, I appreciate your show.
Well, James, on behalf of myself and Rob, Fire Engineering, and Bobby Halton, thanks for what you do. Thanks for being a part of this and coming on and showing your face. Before we stop, so you are presently, the one thing that you didn't share is that you are a stunt double for who?
No,
right
well,
now?
so I did stunts before I was in the fire service, during, and then I stepped away for a while. But we're opening the Bourne stunt show in Orlando, Universal Studios in Orlando. So I'm not Jason Bourne. I'm one of the bad guys, but I'm not allowed to talk too much about it. But they've completely reinvented live stunt shows. It's phenomenal. So when it does open up and all the parks are open again, I highly recommend it. But yeah, this current role is kind of the Jason Bourne world.
Well, cool. If Billy Bob gets a part, give me a call. Okay, I'm in.
I'm doing a stunt double for Burl Ives.
Bobby, thank you for showing up and being a part of it. I know that you have a lot that's going on, and it's pretty cool that you showed up. Rob, it's always good to see you. All the people that attended, honestly, you got to be safe out there. If you wondered what the overall message here was, it's what you thought it was. It could be different than what I intended. That's why I try not to always tell. It's kind of like the message I tell my kids sometimes, or the messages that Bobby says. If he said something, you may not get really what he intended, and that's okay. But it's really about connection. completely about connection. And what you connect with, I don't know. That goes along with self-care. What is your self-care? And with your coworkers and the people you work with, if you don't know what connects with them, friggin' figure it out. That's the real deal. Don't ask me, don't ask Rob or Bobby or James, figure it out. And that goes with your families as well. Please be intentional, and we can't wait to see you again. So be safe out there.